Hi, thank you for joining our EcoActive talk today. My name is Jane and I'm the EcoActive Programme Manager, and I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Hilary Jean. So Hilary brings over 18 years experience working as a campaigner, a policy advisor and a consultant for international organisations such as United Nations agencies, NGO networks and community-based organisations. She has specifically brought expertise to influence legislation and policy areas focused around inequality, human rights, fair trade rules and practices, climate change and the environment, and the quantity and quality of sustainable and climate finance. She has coordinated campaigns and advocacy towards multilateral institutions such as the UN, the World Bank Group and the European Union. Currently, Hilary is a director of Value Metrics, which is a Jersey-based sustainability and business ethics consultancy company. So I'm going to hand you over to Hilary to let you know that we are recording today's session and we will make that recording available publicly after the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jane, and good afternoon, everybody. The title of this talk today is Carbon Emissions versus the Climate Emergency. Is it a case of sucking it up? Just wanted to first go through a bit of housekeeping. So to avoid background noise and interference, all the attendees have been automatically muted. Its video function is only available for the speakers. There is an opportunity, though, to ask questions using the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And questions will be answered at the end of the talk, time permitting. So what's the purpose of this talk? It's to remind us of the climate emergency, to advise on how businesses can reduce their carbon emissions, explore carbon pricing as a tool for governments and businesses, explore carbon markets, propose criteria to guide you in choosing the highest standard carbon offsetting schemes. So to kick it off, we are in a climate emergency. So the climate stripes graphic at the bottom of this slide visually shows us the impact of climate change on Jersey's temperature between 1894 and 2019. Obviously, it's getting redder and redder. There's also been enough reminders in 2020. It's the second hottest year on record, also for marine temperature. This year, globally, we've seen fires, floods, cyclones, locust swarms, and heat waves. Climate change effects are not felt equally. The richest 1% emit more than double that of the poorest global population, or as the World Bank has latest data shows that the average person in the UK emits 65 times more carbon compared to someone in Malawi. Yet people in the poorer countries and communities are facing the brunt of the crisis disproportionately more than those in wealthiest countries. And of course, the COVID pandemic, we can't do a talk without mentioning the current pandemic. And this has shown a clear link to natural habitat destruction. Not only this pandemic, but we've had past ones such as SARS and Ebola. These have all been linked to natural habitat destruction. And there, of course, will be more. So globally, we must ensure we don't go above 1.5 degrees Celsius. This has been a commitment at the Paris Agreement, but also there has been scientific studies, the latest scientific studies show that if we go above 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, it will become irreversible. And we have now 5 years since Paris Agreement, and 38 parliaments or governments have declared a climate emergency, with Jersey being one of these pioneers in 2019. So we now have a 10-year window of action. What this could look like. So the government of Jersey published its carbon neutral strategy at the end of 2019, and it sets out some defining principles, and they've already launched a number of initiatives. But today's talk, we want to drill down into what principle 3 looks like. And it says, for refreshing everyone's memory, what it says is, to get to climate neutrality, we all need to ensure we have taken robust and ambitious actions to reduce emissions. Only after taking these measures, we should consider carbon offsetting. And then any carbon offsetting arrangements should be of the highest recognized standards. So how can we help businesses to reduce carbon emissions? So 2020, as we've just discussed, we've seen huge changes in climate change. We really are seeing that we are in a climate emergency. And it's been clear to many that sustainability needs to be embedded in business models. And on this slide is a greenhouse gas management hierarchy, which provides a scoping and framing approach to GHG management. So it's useful to help businesses such as yourselves on your own journey to net zero emissions, and can be used to help in the transition planning. So let me just walk you through it. Hopefully you can see there's lots of, I'm not sure if you can see all the small text. So every business is of course different, and this approach can be tailored as context and scale of carbon savings vary. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to go work all your way through all at the same time. It's constantly can be evolving and changing, and you can utilize this as you see fit within your business and how it fits to your own carbon reduction strategy. So first, the priority is elimination of carbon emissions. And this should be considered within all business decisions, so not just the major one. Then this followed by carbon and energy reduction. And then following that by substitution measures. So what we mean by this includes understanding the entire life cycle of inputs and services that you utilize, and using your procurement processes to develop an understanding of the materials, the ingredients, and the related activities, such as processing and transport, and making the changes accordingly, so substituting for a lower carbon emissions alternative. And only then you should think about the compensation measures and consider those, including offsetting. So carbon offsetting should be seen as helpful, but not a substitute for genuinely moving towards a low carbon technology. But before you can set reduction targets or understand how much you need to offset, you need to calculate your carbon emissions. And this is just a small reminder that EcoActive has an updated emissions monitoring tool, which is free to help you as a first step. And this you can find on the EcoActive website. But it's important to remember that the data is specific to Jersey context, is more readily available for scope 1 and 2 emissions. And you can see on this graph what we mean by scope 1 and 2. So scope 1 is company vehicles, fuel, combustion and on-site energy generation, and scope 2 is your purchased energy. And this you can find out using the EcoActive's monitoring tool quite easily for a Jersey local context. But there is not a localized scope 3 emissions, and you can see that on the graph there's a scope 3 really means that your full value chain and the full going much beyond necessarily the boundaries of Jersey. And it goes beyond the borders of Jersey. And it's important to remember that it means that your overall quantity will probably be much smaller. So what you actually can measure at the moment, which is scope 1 and 2, is actually probably much smaller than your actual carbon emissions, because it's difficult at the moment to find. There are tools out there, but there is not specifically a localized measuring tool for your scope 3. So it will your overall carbon emissions amount will probably be much bigger than you're able at the moment to measure. And although it's the hardest to measure, management of scope 3 emissions enables organizations to mitigate risk within their entire value chain. It can unlock new innovations and collaborations, and also it responds to the mounting pressure from investors, customers, and civil society. So it's very important that within this overall discussion, when you're talking about how to measure your carbon emissions, that scope 3 does come into that, even though it may be a bit more, it may be a bit harder or difficult to actually calculate what that will be. And there are tools and experts out there that can help you on this. And so overall at the moment, Jersey with its carbon neutral strategy has calculated that with projected reductions, Jersey will still need as a whole, as a community, to offset 277,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide yearly from 2030. So once you have reduced your carbon as much as possible, you need to still abate a number of your emissions that's impossible to reduce. And that's when you can start looking into your how that offsetting works and what that looks like. And so there's a number of tools that can be used in this regard. And it's important to step back for a second and think, maybe we need to assign a price to carbon to help you as a tool, as governments, but also as businesses, in able to put a price on the environmental, social and economic damage that has been caused by emission polluting gases. So what economists say, call it assuming a negative externality, or the polluter pays principle. And so by assigning a price to greenhouse gas, it helps redirect investments by governments and companies towards less polluting production and consumption models. So what we have here is that in the Kyoto Protocol, which was signed in 2008, they agreed to create a world carbon dioxide emissions market in which countries and companies could buy and sell certificates of emission based on whether they emitted greenhouse gas or help reduce emissions through renewable energy. So this, for example, many of you may have heard about the European Union emissions trading system, and this is the largest carbon market in the world. Now, the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015, means that there will be potentially a drastic change to the carbon markets. At the moment, negotiations are still happening because there are tensions under Article 6 of what this carbon markets framing and will look like in the future. So this could dramatically change. So at the moment, we're in a balance here between what is happening at the moment that sits under Kyoto Protocol and what potentially could look like in the future, depending on how the negotiations if conclude or carry on after COP26 next year. We also have governments can tax emissions. So a tax, unlike the emissions market, fixes a price on the emissions. And you have, for example, our own Jersey's fuel duty tax that we have had established here in Jersey, but also with bigger discussions, for example, in the EU Green New Deal, there is discussions now about carbon border adjustment mechanisms to help adjust the amount of mainly that scope 3 that's coming into the EU. So there's a lot of ways that different governments are exploring those carbon taxes. Then there's also tools that can be used where many companies that are not subjected to the regulated emissions market that we were talking about earlier under Kyoto, but they want to themselves impose a carbon price voluntarily. Now, this can happen in two ways. You can evaluate the possible costs that the imposition of a tax on emissions could have, so as to redirect future investment. And this is known as internal carbon pricing. And there's lots of different tools out there that can help you evaluate and measure what this could look like. And then also there's buying offset credits. But all these, the carbon pricing and all these kind of tools that underline carbon pricing is effective only if the price assigned to the emission is high enough to mobilize investments towards non-polluting businesses. And there has been controversies and difficulties and challenges around carbon pricing and around the different areas that I was talking about, the different tools on assigning a price to carbon. Now, globally, there is about 31 emission trading systems, so the emissions trading schemes, and this can range from regional to national to subnational jurisdictions. And there's about 30 carbon taxes being applied at this moment, and that usually happens at a national level. So in total, this carbon pricing at the moment covers about 22% of global GHG emissions, which means there is definitely potential for more and for understanding this area better and to actually getting maybe even international carbon price to be able to have one price for everybody, because of course it differentiates between jurisdictions. And so Valuemetrics was asked to do a research on what carbon markets there are out there, what other jurisdictions are doing and the choices that they make, and the potential for Jersey. And as I said before, of course, under the Paris Agreement, the carbon markets could potentially change dramatically depending on how the negotiations go at COP26. And so we actually don't know, we're in a state of flux at the moment. We don't exactly know where that could sit from that wider perspective. But if we looked at it from a current and what's happening now, it was felt that Jersey would not benefit from being part of a mandatory carbon market for several reasons. One is that we don't have mandatory target reductions obligations set under Kyoto or Paris. We are extended Kyoto agreements. We've been extended that by, and so we do submit our carbon emissions to the UK, and then they take those on. But we don't have any, for Jersey ourselves, we don't have any obligations to reduce our targets. Emissions. And then of course there's a lack of heavy industry, which mainly is in these mandatory carbon markets, that really relies on mainly these huge heavy industries to then be encouraging them to reduce their carbon emissions. And as Jersey, we don't have necessarily those heavy industry that would then actually have a big reduction in our emissions on island. And we also have a limited scale of economy. So this, to expand the carbon market or make it as robust, this wouldn't be necessarily the way to go. And finally, and something that was raised quite a lot with a lot of people when we did the research and we went and talked to different experts, is that it's very costly to set up. It's very large bureaucratic overheads. And so this, because there's a lot of monitoring, verifying and tracking, and then of course compliance, and if not compliance, then issuing of fines, which will be huge cost to Jersey with limited returns, we felt. So we tried to balance that, and we felt that that wasn't the right market to carbon markets to go down. And so we started exploring what voluntary carbon markets and what that looked like could look like for Jersey. Now, voluntary carbon markets, or the same as carbon markets, it's compensating emissions by funding equivalent carbon dioxide savings elsewhere. But the challenge is for, and maybe you have found this yourselves, is that by the buyers trying to find the right carbon reduction projects out there, they're finding to navigate the various standards to find high quality projects, high quality carbon credits, transparent prices is really difficult to find. It's not a huge market. It represents about 0.01% of the carbon markets. So it's very small, but it is growing. And this is growing because more and more businesses who aren't having to be under the mandatory carbon markets, their activities and their what they're doing doesn't come under that mandatory carbon markets. But at the same time, of course, everybody is wanting to try to reduce their carbon emissions and their impact on the environment. And so this is a way to do that, but it's a very small market. And that means also schemes vary in quality, and it's much harder to estimate how much CO2 is really being removed, because the methodology of measurements for that vary across the projects, across the standards. So there is not a set standard for measuring this. So you can think of these kind of projects, and I used this example the other day with Jane, and she said that I should bring this to you. It's basically saying, you know, going out there to try and choose your projects is like going to try and buying the right t-shirt. You can go to Primark and you can get your £1 t-shirt, and you may think that's great, I've got a nice cheap t-shirt, but you don't think about the impacts of the chain that's got to that point of creating that t-shirt, because you've got your t-shirt, but you haven't seen maybe that behind that £1 t-shirt is people who have not been paid living wages. There's been environmental standards have been breached, etc. So it's difficult to really understand what's behind that product, just that there is a cheaper price, where you have potentially another t-shirt that is definitely costs a little bit more, but it's got fair trade and an organic standard stamped on it, and you know that those standards have been followed up with the fair trade movement, with the organic movement, and they've been assigned that because standards have been accepted. And you accept that you will pay a little bit more for that, knowing that there are a number of criteria that has been reached for that t-shirt to have those standards on there. So I just wanted you to keep that image in mind when you think of all the different carbon offsetting projects out there, that this can be, you can have a huge range between your very, very cheap t-shirt and your much more expensive t-shirt. And there's a lot of things that can be unpicked to get to the bottom of what the impact is of creating those t-shirts. So where do these carbon offsetting, these voluntary carbon markets really, the projects, where are they? Mainly, they are in developing countries. So they are in those countries, like least developed countries, and their project size is usually much smaller than mandatory crediting mechanisms. You don't usually find huge infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure projects within the voluntary carbon market. Usually these are much smaller projects. Doesn't necessarily mean they're less impactful, but it does mean that they are much smaller if you're trying to think of buying in bulk. There are the project types that you will find. Traditionally, it's been mainly replace and reduce. What I mean by replace is you're replacing fossil fuels with low carbon alternatives, or you're reducing the amount of fossil fuel energy consumed. But now more and more, there has been this push for projects to have to be about capture. And what we mean by that is reforestation, stopping deforestation, so natural-based solutions. And these are being more and more recognized as a kind of a win-win solution. So it involves the protecting, restoring, and sustainably managing ecosystems. But you can find any projects within replace, reduce, or capture, and this will be within the offsetting markets. Now, what's increasingly important, and as I come back to my analogy about the t-shirts, is co-benefits of a project. I would encourage that is something to look into and request what's going on co-benefits. That's the word that is used in the voluntary carbon markets. So having projects that link to wider conservation, such as habitat or biodiversity, it's important that, maybe we're thinking we want to do a project and planting a lot of trees, but there's a lot of more that goes into that. Kind of what kind of trees, what is the natural habitat? Is it a monoculture, or will you be able to encourage the increase in biodiversity and the whole ecosystem, looking at that whole ecosystem, and rather than specifically just one project on just like you planting trees. So that's really important to think of that wider conservation. Obviously, livelihoods for the local communities is extremely important. As I said, the projects are in developing countries. Our main developing countries, obviously, they're in places that are poor and vulnerable people. And for them, this needs to be seen as a livelihood project as well. Otherwise it will not work. There needs to be local ownership and local commitments to the project and involvement. So that's really important that they are included and that they are considered within that project, and that wider livelihoods is considered. And as I've said just now, the inclusion and community-led projects, that is really led by what the communities want. So it's not imposed by outsiders, but it's really built from the community level up. And this will mean more sustainability in the future for that project. But also, for example, if it is a tree planting project, for example, that you don't find that actually being built in an area where the locals need it for other use, and you'll find that there is suddenly a big conflict between what the locals need that land for and what is needed from the project of keeping carbon emissions sucked into the ground. And also environmental and social safeguards, that they are in place with these kind of projects. There has been a lot of problems in the past with projects, with land grabbing, with human rights abuses, especially with local Indigenous communities. So it's very important to scrutinise those safeguards and that they are all in place and that this is not having a negative impact on the local communities that the project is being implemented in. Also, just it's important to realise that the voluntary carbon markets are not regulated. There is definitely some best practice principles out there that the top standard setters adhere to, but at the moment that's as far as it goes. Now in September this year, Mark Carney had launched a private sector voluntary carbon markets task force, the long name, which is developing at the moment recommendations on scaling up the voluntary carbon markets. And this includes developing core carbon principles. So it would be across the whole industry. It would be attributed taxonomy, so everybody knows what they're talking about when we're talking about different meanings for things, and encouraging a global carbon price that brings back to what I was talking about before about the importance of a carbon price, but actually instead of having lots of different jurisdictions, different areas, having a different carbon price, but actually having a set carbon price, and encouraging a standard methodology for measuring and verifying as well, so that when the buyers go out and you go out to choose which projects you want, that there is some standards set that you are able to know what you're buying. Now there's no centralized voluntary greenhouse gas or carbon credit market as well. So project developers, those that are developing those projects that we've been talking about, can sell their credits directly to buyers, sell their credits through a broker or an exchange, or sell to a retailer who then resells the credits to a buyer. So there's lots of different ways and different stakeholders within this chain. And it would be important to see to understand that at the moment in a lot of projects, only 28% of the final price goes to the setup and running of a project. So it's important when you're taking your projects and you're choosing your projects to find out price transparency and to see who is taking the cut and why. Why are they taking this cut? As we said before, co-benefits are so important, and to include the local community and ensuring that they have a strong livelihoods element within the project is really important. But if the projects themselves are only getting such a small amount of the overall price of that particular carbon credit, then there needs to be some transparency and understanding of who is getting what within the chain. There are leading standard setters out there. Vera takes up about 73% of the markets, followed by Gold Standard, which 15%, but there are others out there. So it is, there are different ones to choose from, standard setters there. And then of course there are ones who are setting up themselves and not going through standard setter specifically. Now, costs. I'm sure you're all thinking, what is the cost? Well, the cost really varies significantly depending on those projects, what we're talking about, the reduce, the replace or capture, the kind of location. So where that is within different countries, of course, they all cost differently to set up these kind of projects, and the transaction type. So how much you're actually going to be buying. But what's really important to understand is that not necessarily the cost of verification and compliance is priced into what is currently the market price for carbon credits, and that's so a lot of the time other funding is coming in to help develop those projects, and so that means what I'm the next point on the slide, that actually at the moment carbon credits cost about $3 a ton, which is below the average price of a compliance market carbon credit. And this doesn't include, like I said before, about the verification and compliance, but sometimes also not the co-benefits. So you'll actually can find that you have a $3, but you will actually can find other carbon credits that are actually higher, depending on what else that is wrapped into the project. Now, in Davos in 2017, so the World Economic Forum, they actually survey not CSOs, that's the wrong word, the CEOs, to find out if, how they felt about the pricing of carbon markets, both compliance and voluntary. And the CEOs felt that actually they should be paying between $20 and $45 a ton, rather than at the current level of 3. And the World Bank has actually even come and said that's actually further in their calculations. They feel that it should be between $40 and $80. So as I said before, my last slide, about carbon pricing, carbon pricing only works if it's incentivized enough to help people reduce those carbon emissions and actually makes changes and innovation to change. And so this is quite important at the moment that we have a situation where you have such a low amount of carbon credit price on carbon credits, that it would potentially be easier to be buying those instead of really taking the time to go through that greenhouse gas emissions management hierarchy, and actually go, can we eliminate, can we reduce, can we substitute before going to compensate and looking at this other areas. So what steps can businesses take? As I said, we can calculate your carbon emissions using, say, the Scope 1 and 2 EcoActives monitoring tool that you can find on our website, and take time to think about your Scope 3 emissions. There are, it may be more difficult, but there are tools and experts out there that can help you with that, and it's something that more and more pressure is on to take the time to understand your Scope 3 emissions, and always think that actually your calculation will probably be under what it actually is. So always try to make it a bit bigger than and try to expand it more. Then you should try to eliminate your carbon emissions and go through that management tool system to help you. And then you should, when you get down to to compensating abating your final emissions that you're unable to eliminate or reduce, you should try and choose, design and customize projects you want to support, and highlight what additional benefits are important to you. Try to meet the highest standards that you can, and then obviously purchase the carbon offsetting project, carbon offset credits, and then retire them. I think it's very important. This usually naturally happens, but it's important that they are not able to be used again. So they have to be retired so that no one else can use them. And so finally, from all these discussions and from all this research that we've been doing, we've set up a proposal that we're going to present to the Citizens Assembly, that hopefully will be starting next year, in Q1 next year, fingers crossed. And so this proposal kind of helps come back to that principle 3 that I was talking earlier in the carbon neutral strategy of Jersey, about trying to meet the highest standards. So once we've eliminated as much as we can, we need to offset the rest. What does that look like? It's fantastic that Mark Carney and his task force are trying to increase the standards of the voluntary carbon market. But before that happens, we also want, as Jersey, to be able to see as high as that we can. And so this is kind of a proposal, set of criteria to help you, and it will go towards the Citizens Assembly as well, to maybe for Jersey itself to when it has to purchase some offsetting credits. But this can be utilised by yourselves to try and get yourself to the highest standards that we aspire to. So the first one is having those clear emissions reduction strategy before you offset. Then finding a project that regularly monitors, reports and verifies, has verification by a third party. And it's based on a realistic and credible baseline. So it ensures additionality to avoid double counting. That it does not no net harm, so complies with social, environmental and ecological safeguards I was talking about before. There is transparency in the due diligence, transparency in the flow of funds and the price, and in the data. that all stakeholders are consulted. It's really key that the local community and local authorities are involved and have ownership of these projects. And that there is also a clear agreement with local and national governments on who actually owns these carbon credits and where does the money go from the selling of the credits. Especially as within Paris, we have all countries now have national determined contributions. They are all putting their reduction emissions targets they're all announcing that. It's important to understand who actually owns those reduction targets and who is going to be owning those credits as well. The co-benefits, I would really encourage that is part of your carbon offsetting project, that co-benefits such as livelihoods, biodiversity is included. And we come back to that t-shirt. It would be, a proposal would be of interest to say, look, set a floor price for what you think should be the carbon price for your offset project. So it's not what the market says it is, but actually what do you think it should be? And then with that premium that you have, then when you buy your carbon offset credit on the market, with that premium, you can then be able to place it and be able to utilize it to develop further carbon offsetting projects or livelihood projects or local biodiversity enhancement projects. So trying to think that there needs to be a premium in that to actually to understand the true cost and the true price of what carbon should be, and take time to think about that as a business. We've also put down here, safeguard Jersey's reputation. So ensure that carbon removal is permanent. So the kind of choosing the projects, and if you're using those projects to say, look, we are going to be reducing our carbon and we are using offsetting as part of that management, to ensure that that carbon is permanently removed. And lastly, to encourage that the projects would link the communities together and have that connection. I think that's key to long-term sustainability, is to more and more link communities together, to see that we are all in this together. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and I hope I encourage EcoActive to do more talks like this in the future, and hopefully in the future we can be in person so we can have more interaction or face-to-face. So I'm wishing you a good day, and also potentially a Merry Christmas and New Year if I don't see anyone before then. Bye.